at the table.
Morning. Welcome to Grace. I'm so glad you're here. My name is Stephen Ingram. I'm the pastor of Students, Missions, and Adult Formation, and it's good to see you this morning, whether you're here in person or join us online. This morning, we're going to continue in our stewardship series that's going to be going through the month of October. Last week, we started off, Tyler, our pastor, talked to us about the parable of the great banquet. And that's the reason why, if you weren't here last week, that's the reason why we have a gigantic table here. He talked to us about the parable of the great banquet. And if you're not familiar with that story, it's a story that Jesus tells of a master of a house. And this person has great wealth and decides to throw a huge banquet. And so he sends out all the invitations. And when it comes time for the banquet, none of the people who he sends the invitations to show up. And so then he sends his servants out into the street, to the destitute, to the poor, to those who never thought that they would be invited to such a feast. And he said, bring them in, for everyone is welcome at this table. That's how we started off this series, and that's why we have this beautiful table. If you notice that the silverware and the place settings don't match, it's because so many of you brought those to represent not only how broad and wide the table is, but to represent you and your families at that table, and how diverse of a table that the table of God really is. I love the theme of tables and gatherings and food and dinner. I love it because I love to cook, I love to eat, I love to gather with friends and family. And so this is a series that really connects with me on a personal level. So much so that as I was thinking about this series and thinking about today and today's sermon, I really started to realize that over the past 5 years, my role in terms of family gatherings has really changed. And I bet most of you are probably in this or have experienced this already. See, about 5 years ago, I moved from that place of being able to show up about 30 minutes before Thanksgiving dinner and then falling asleep promptly 30 minutes after Thanksgiving dinner. I moved to being the one making Thanksgiving dinner. Through the failing health of some grandparents and the death of some great-grandparents, the role of the host moved to me and my sister-in-law, and we became the hosts of the big family dinners, the Thanksgiving, the Christmas Eve, the Easter, those sorts of times. I like to host. I think I do a pretty good job of it because I like to cook fancy food, and I like to throw a party. I like to get the music right. I like to get all the things going. And most of the time, it works really, really well, and people are really excited and really happy. And it was Thanksgiving dinner a couple of years ago, and I was trying out a new recipe that I was really excited about. I don't know if you've ever made flaming rum punch before, but it is quite the treat. And so here's the scene for you. Okay, you got a big pot, and you cut oranges in half, and you dot them with cloves and some cinnamon sticks. You put a little bit of apple cider down in the bottom of this pot, and you start baking and roasting this pot with these oranges and cloves and cinnamon and apple smell. You're getting it, right? It's time for fall, right? And these things are wafting through the house for about 45 minutes to an hour. And then you get it out, and it's time for the fireworks, right? Because the flaming rum punch, it's time to do the flaming part, right? And so you take the rum, and you go ahead and pour a good bit of it in there, and then you take a ladle, and you pour it in, you light it, and you pour it in, and then the flame comes, and it is spectacular, except for when it's not. So here's a video.
Whoa. Okay, come, take a boost.
It's flaming
Boost and
rum.
look.
I can't see that.
Boost and look.
These are my nieces and nephews and my kids.
Mabel, what's that?
It's all fun and games until you set your sister-in-law's house on fire. So I find with that video, by the way, this video's been played 10,000 times in my family, and it only happened like 2 years ago. I find that video, it's helpful to watch it one time, let people kind of digest it, and then give you some things to watch for the next time, and then watch it again. So 2 things I want you to watch for. The first one is I want you to listen to my oldest daughter who starts screaming, "The table's on fire." Okay, that's the first thing. And then the second thing I want you to watch for is my youngest daughter, Nora, and you'll see when the camera pops back up, you'll just see his head running across the room, okay? So let's watch the video one more time.
Whoa. Okay, come take a boost.
It's my boost and look. I can't see that.
Boost and look. Do you see the flames though? Boost.
A little bit of rum left.
What's that?
The cat is on fire.
I find it's really good and helpful to start off the sermon with some self-deprecation. I think it kind of levels the room out a little bit. But you know, it's fun because those kinds of gatherings are what make family, right? It doesn't always go right, but community forms around it. What I want us to do before we jump into the text is we're going to put a number on the screen here in a second. Because this morning we're going to be talking about hospitality. And what I would like for you to do is in an act of vulnerability, I would love for you to think about a time when you've been invited to a gathering where you've not felt welcome, where you walked in and you felt unwelcomed, or the gathering was very inhospitable to you. You felt like an outsider. Any kind of gathering. But we're going to have a number on the screen for the next few minutes, and I would love for you to text in a couple of sentences about what that experience was like. These are completely anonymous, and trust me, the first service took advantage of the anonymity of this exercise, okay? So you can be completely honest. We won't know who texted in what. They were talking about in-laws and everything last time, so have at it, okay? But that number will be on the screen for the next few minutes. This morning, we're going to be using the example, the metaphor of the table again. We're going to be using the metaphor of gathering together and dinner parties and things like that. But please, under no circumstance should you understand that this is a sermon on how to throw a better dinner party. This is a sermon about how to be a better community of faith. And we're going to take it from an unlikely source. We're going to be looking at Luke chapter 19, which is the story of Zacchaeus. And if you've ever gone to children's church, you know the story of Zacchaeus because that's where we tell the story of Zacchaeus. We tell it because Zacchaeus was a wee little man, and a wee little man was he, and he climbed up the sycamore tree, right? And I was talking to Lynn before the service earlier, and I said, it's a real shame that we relegated Zacchaeus to the children's table because sure, children can relate to him being small and climbing the tree, but the lessons for us as communities of faith are anything but childlike. These are deep and important lessons. And so what we're going to do is we're going to read this story this morning, and we're going to look at 4 lessons of hospitality that we learn from the story of Zacchaeus. So if you would like to look with me, we're in Luke chapter 19. Verses 1 through 10. And this is talking about Jesus entering into Jericho. It says, he entered into Jericho and was passing through it. A man was there named Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was rich. He was trying to see who Jesus was, but on account of the crowd, he could not because he was short in stature. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore tree to see him because he was going to pass that way. When Jesus came to the place, he looked up and said to him, Zacchaeus, hurry, come down, for I must stay at your house today. So he hurried down and was happy to welcome him. All who saw it began to grumble and said, he has gone to be the guest of one who is a sinner. Zacchaeus stood there and said to the Lord, look, half of my possessions, Lord, I'll give to the poor. And if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I will pay that back 4 times as much. Then Jesus said to him, today, salvation has come to this house because he too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek out and save the lost. I want us to look at this story and kind of break it down, and I believe through this story we can understand some rules about how we as communities of faith and how we as individuals of faith can practice a more Christian understanding of hospitality at our tables. The first thing is that Jesus does not ask if he can come to Zacchaeus' house. You know, from the story, we get this sense that Zacchaeus and Jesus have never met before. It said that he wanted to go and see who he was and wanted to kind of get a bird's eye view and kind of understand what was going on. And so for Jesus to just be passing along, look up at Zacchaeus and invite himself in. He didn't say, can I? He said, Zacchaeus, come down. I'm coming to your house today. For us, that is a wild story. I mean, can you imagine? My sister-in-law, who I set her table on fire, they're in this weekend, and they had a long weekend, and so they're in, and we went out to dinner last night. Could you imagine leaving some nice dinner downtown Birmingham and some guy walking up to you on the street and say, hey, I'm coming to your house for dinner tonight, right? You're calling the police probably, right? That's a scary situation, but that is a modern problem that we have, because up until about the 18th century, Christian hospitality was a core tenet of the moral fabric of what it meant to be a Christian. In her book, Making Room, Christine Pohl, who's a professor of church and society at Asbury Theological Seminary, it's a Methodist seminary, wrote about what it means for us to understand the history of Christian hospitality, what happened to it in the 18th century, and how we can reclaim it as a practice. See, before the 18th century, this idea of Christian hospitality was a moral imperative. It was just the same as you tithing, as you doing service work, as you inviting the people to church. It was talked about in the same sentences, okay? It was not something that, if you get a chance to, all right? And it's the same thing that Jesus is assuming here. I am coming to your house this afternoon. Christine Pohl talks about until the 18th century, Christian hospitality was one of the most significant Christian moral practices. And we lost it with some scholars will argue that we lost it as we moved to more individualized and less communal-based societies, where we could have our houses with our four walls and our fences, and we were able to self-sustain. I didn't have to go to the baker to get my bread. I had to go to the butcher to get the meat. I didn't have to go to the farmer to get we could just go to the grocery store, come back to our house, and live our lives as these kind of individualistic units, right? So much so that John Calvin, the reformer in the 1500s, decried the modernization of the inn, the place where if you were traveling, you would go and you would pay money to stay at the inn. That was really coming up on the rise, the kind of modern understanding and modern version of the inn, the hotel. He decried it, and he said that it is not the job of others to provide space for the stranger. It is the job of the church. And so he really rallied against inns coming into his towns and the places where his churches were. This idea of hospitality is not just a Christian hospitality. We see it as a core tenet of all three of the Abrahamic faiths. You see it in Islam, in Judaism, and in Christianity. When we talk about the sin of Sodom, Sodom and Gomorrah, fire raining down, destroying the whole thing, Jesus said the sin of Sodom was a sin of inhospitality. It was a sin that the town was so inhospitable to the strangers who were coming through it. When we read Hebrews chapter 13, verses 1 and 2, it says this: "Let mutual love continue. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for by doing so, some have entertained angels without even knowing it." I mean, if you look at the book of Acts, the book of Acts, the first Christian church was a communal organization. They pooled all their resources and money together. They ate together. They lived together. And they looked for the widows, the orphan, the destitute, the poor, those who could not take care of themselves. And they didn't give them handouts. They brought them into the community. This idea of Christian hospitality is one that is core to the ancient understanding of our faith, and one that we have lost in some pretty tremendous ways. Now, what you have to think too, and what you have to understand, is that when Jesus said, "Zacchaeus, come down, for today I'm coming to your house," it would have been one thing if it was Jesus walking along with Zacchaeus and he had one guy over for dinner. But Jesus brought with him an entourage, right? He had his 12 disciples. He had those disciples who were not generally named who also traveled with him, and he had the masses. So we get this sense that the town shows up, okay? Jericho shows up at Zacchaeus' house. This is not a one-off kind of situation. This is a big, big table that Jesus is asking Zacchaeus to prepare. So the first thing we want to think about is that Jesus does not ask in this story, he commands. Jesus does not ask us as Christians, as a Christian community, to, hey, welcome people in, that's a good thing. He says, no, this is core to who you are as a follower of mine. The second thing that we want to look at and think about as a part of this story is that there is a confessional aspect to being hospitable. There's a confessional aspect. We don't know in the story if it's because Jesus tells Zacchaeus he's coming and people are grumbling, and so Zacchaeus begins to confess his sins, or if it's because just being in the presence of Jesus, it calls Zacchaeus to reimagine what his life could look like, to look inside and understand how he had wronged others. But either way, the very next thing Zacchaeus does is he begins to confess. There becomes a confessional nature to his hospitality, an act of repentance, an act of recognizing the faults in his life and beginning to make right those faults by first confessing. Priya Parker, I don't know if you've ever heard of Priya Parker. She wrote a book called The Art of Gathering. If you've never read the book, I really would encourage it. It's a great book. It's not a Christian book. She's not a Christian, but I think it has some incredible principles that are relevant both for us as individual Christians and as communities of faith. It's also great if you're a small group leader. Fantastic book to sort of think about how you convene small groups in new and maybe even more hospitable ways. But in her book, The Art of Gathering, she says that a core principle of making spaces hospitable to others is what she calls a principle of bringing your real self instead of your best self. See, she understands, and she kind of extrapolates it in this book, that if we all come to the table pretending to be perfect, then we will never get below a surface level of relationship and understanding of each other. I'm sure you probably have been to a home for a dinner party before where you walk into the home and you realize very quickly you've not walked into a home, you've walked into a museum, right? You're scared to lean up against the wall, much less sit down on the couch, because it looks like the couch has never actually been sat on before, right? You're worried that you didn't wash your clothes enough because you might soil this beautiful place, right? Those are not fun dinner parties, right? Those are not fun places to be because you're so tense, and the environment that's been created for you is one that is not real. Priya Parker says there has to be a confessional, authentic nature to our gatherings, or they will never go to a deeper level. Later on in that chapter, she actually writes and says, if the guests are not being vulnerable, if they're not being confessional, if they don't let their real selves, not their best self, but their real self come out, then the problem lies on the host. She says the guests aren't doing that naturally, it's because the host has created an atmosphere where they don't feel comfortable because they feel like they're having to live up to the host's expectations. And so in the chapter, she writes and she says, host, reveal thyself, right? We have to create communities that are real and authentic. One of the things I love about our church, and I'm not just saying this because you pay me, I'm saying this because I really do love this about our church. This is a real place. This is a real place. And there will be temptations, and there have been temptations in the life of this church, in the history of this church, to be a little more polished and a little less real. It's a gift to be real. It's a gift to be vulnerable, and it's a gift to be authentic. And it is a gift that this community of faith has figured out and is doing pretty well. Doesn't mean we don't need to keep working on it, but it is something that we do pretty well. And I want to encourage you to remember that vulnerability is a strength. It doesn't harm us. It actually strengthens us. The third point that I want us to look at, beyond the fact that Jesus commands us to do this and the fact that being vulnerable and being confessional is a core of hospitality, is that when after Zacchaeus confesses his sins, he then goes and takes the next step of reconciliation. See, it's not enough just to say that we have wronged others, or it's not enough just to say that we have faults and that we're not perfect, okay? That's good. But we have to take the next step, because to admit our sin, to admit our faults and not to correct them, I would argue is maybe to commit another sin or another fault. We have the opportunity, when we understand that we're not perfect, that we have offended, we have hurt, we have harmed, we've caused harm, that we have the opportunity to then be a part of God's good work of reconciliation in this world. And Zacchaeus does it on two different levels. The first thing he says is, I am going to take half of my wealth, half of the money I have, and I am going to give it to the poor. Now, we remember that Zacchaeus is a tax collector, and just to give us a quick picture of first century tax collector life, the way it worked was a tax collector was employed by the government, and the government had a certain amount of taxes that it would take from each individual or each family. The way the tax collector made their money is then they would take an amount on top of that, and that would be their salary. It's almost like a collector's fee. Now, the reason why tax collectors were always seen as sinners in the Bible is because they were known to take an exorbitant amount of money. It wasn't a living wage, it was to get rich on. Remember, how was Zacchaeus introduced? As a tax collector and a very rich man, right? And so we don't get the sense that Zacchaeus in this first part is righting the wrongs of being the tax collector. He's just talking about societal reconciliation. He is leaning into what the prophets talked about in terms of lowering the mountains and raising up the valleys, okay? Finding those who are hurting, who are poor, who cannot take care of themselves, who are finding themselves at their rope's end because they don't know where the next meal is going to come from. And he says, I want to take half of my wealth, in the presence of Jesus, I want to take half of my wealth and give it to the poor. He understands by being in that presence that there is work to do. Christine Pohl, who I mentioned earlier, talks about we re-spun the idea of Christian hospitality in the 18th century. Because prior to the 18th century, it was about the stranger. It was about the poor. It was about the widow and the orphan. It was about those who can't take care of themselves, those who have been harmed. That is who we practice Christian hospitality to. After the 18th century, it became more and more and more about friends and family and acquaintances. One of the things that is incredibly important to understand is that the church didn't lose the word hospitality. We just remodeled it based on Disney World. Disney World is a fabulously hospitable place. I can tell you story after story after story of how hospitable Disney is, and they really are. But Disney isn't hospitable just because they love me, right? If they did, they would send me tickets right now, and I would go. It's not because they love me. It's because they want me to come back. They want me to have a good experience so I can tell my friends and my family about the good experience. It's based on consumerism. And the church has adopted that model of hospitality, not this biblical Christian model of hospitality. See, in the Christian model of hospitality, we expect to get no reward. There's no follow-up. The church has gotten good at hospitality because we want follow-up. We want them to come back, right? We want the guests to come back. We want them to be tithing members. We want them to be small group leaders. And all those are good things. But if that is our foundation for being hospitable, then we've missed the point. We've turned it into a consumer model instead of a biblical model. John Wesley said this: One great reason why the rich in general have so little sympathy for the poor is because we so seldom visit them. Hence, it is that one part of the world does not know what the other suffers. Many of them do not know because they do not care to know. They keep out of the way of knowing it, and then plead their voluntary ignorance as an excuse for their hardness of heart. Wesley didn't pull any punches on this kind of thing. This was core to who Wesley was as a Christian. This is the work that we get to do in the community. But I will argue, if we only do it out in the community, then we're missing one of the greatest parts of it. And this is good, right? We are in beautiful partnership with a village in Nicaragua. And for years and years and years, we would go down there and partner with them and be in those relationships and be in community. And we hope to be able to get back to that soon. Since we haven't been able to go down, we send money and help them with projects and do things like that when we pray for them. But if it's just going out and dropping our little bites of service in and then retreating back, then we've missed so much of what it means to be in these reconciling communities. So he recognizes the first one is poor, but then what he does is he takes it one step farther and he says, and anyone who I have wronged, I will repay them fourfold. Now again, remember, the sense here is that it's not just Jesus and his disciples. The sense here is that half of Jericho has shown up. And because of the nature of Zacchaeus' job as a tax collector, we're talking about a pretty substantial financial commitment he's making here. But he seems to do it without batting an eye. And here's the thing. Here's why this is important. Imagine those people from the community, most of whom he has wronged. Imagine those people being invited into his house with Jesus. I can't imagine going to the house, to the dinner party of someone who has robbed me and my family and does it on an annual basis under the guise of a law. Can you imagine that? And I think Zacchaeus, whether he understood it in that moment or maybe understood it later, he got the fact that he cannot be a good host. He cannot be truly hospitable unless he rights the wrongs. The church has made a lot of wrongs. You know what? This church has probably made some wrongs too. We probably have hurt people. The church as a whole, Christianity, American Christianity, has hurt a lot of people. The very people that we look at and say, these are the marginalized, these are the poor, these are the ones who have been cast out. The church puts a rubber stamp on it and says, yes, they should be cast out. I will say that's one beautiful thing about this church that I love, is this church says, we know that the church has hurt you. And we want to welcome you in because we want to be different than that. That's what Zacchaeus is doing here. He's saying, look, there's sin that I can own. There's sin that we can own collectively as Christianity. Let's be the kind of church that reconciles that sin, opens those doors wide, and brings in people and begins the healing, the good healing work of God in our midst. Reconciliation has to be a part of hospitality, so much so when we think about this communion table, Jesus says, if you are coming to this table and you have sinned against a brother or a sister, if you have wronged someone, go and right that wrong first, fix it, and then come to this table. It is built into our communion liturgy that before we can be at this table in good standings, we have to right the wrongs that we've committed in the world. And last but not least, hospitality is not about us. It's not about our wants and desires. It's not about our preferences. Hospitality is putting ourselves second, our desires, our preferences, our wants second. Because if I only care about the things I want, if I only set the metaphorical table with the things that I want and I desire, I am only inviting in a certain group of people. Back in 2001, it was January of 2001, I was in Jordan and Syria for a month, traveling with school. I was studying abroad. I was over there for a month, and there were 12 of us, 12 white English-speaking college kids in a country that was very different. It was the first time I'd even gotten on an airplane before, okay? And we're in a country that is very, very, very different than anything any of us had known. We were in a country where you'd wake up before the sun rose because the call to prayer, the Muslim call to prayer, was blaring out over the minarets across whatever town you were in. It smelled different. You didn't get to understand, you couldn't understand the language. The pace was different. Everything was different. If you want to talk about feeling uncomfortable in a place, I felt a little boy from Piedmont, Alabama, I felt really uncomfortable in this place. And we were a few days into the trip, and we were going from Amman, which is the capital of Jordan and pretty much the center of the country, down the main highway. It goes through the center of the country, down to the Gulf of Aqaba, which is down on the Red Sea. It's about a 4-hour trip, and we're about 3 hours in. It was starting to get dark, and our van that we were in broke down on the side of the road. And we're pretty much in desert land here, okay? There's nothing as far as you can see, and that's a scary place to be. It was already scary enough, right? And our van breaks down, and about 500 feet down the road, there's one structure. It's a cinder block house, 3 rooms. So our translator and our guide, we walk 500 feet or so down to this cinder block house. And before we could even get to knock on the door, the family came out who lived in this house. It was a man, a woman, his wife, and 2 children. The man immediately saw what had happened. He got his tools. He got a big jug of water because he thought we had overheated. And he and our guide went to the van to start working on it. Immediately, we were invited in this tiny little house, 12 of us, 12 white kids from Alabama who didn't speak a lick of Arabic. Were invited in this house, and immediately you started to hear the rustle, the clanking of cups and little spoons. And the mom had started to prepare tea for us. They have this beautiful dandelion tea. And the kids were bringing us our little cups with our little saucers and our little spoons to put our sugar in the tea, and they served us tea. And we were there for a couple hours, and before long, I looked into the kitchen, and through the translator we were talking, I looked into the kitchen, there's a giant pot of goat and rice. And it was dinner time. And before long, the mom started bringing out plates, putting some goat, putting some rice, and pouring some yogurt sauce over it and handing it to each of them. This was a huge pot that was probably this family's meal for the next week. And they gave it to us 12 white, non-Arabic speaking Christians in their Muslim home. They took such beautiful care of us. And for the first time in my life, I got what hospitality was. Hospitality before to me was putting up with the strangers who were in your house long enough for them to leave, right? For the first time from this Muslim family, I finally understood what hospitality really should look like in my faith. It was beautiful, it was life-changing, and I will never, ever, ever forget that moment. What was uncomfortable for me was probably 100 times more uncomfortable for that family. They gave of themselves, they sacrificed so that we would feel comfortable. We as the Christian church need to learn a lesson from that Muslim family about how we can be in our community, in our town, in our society, and in our world. That hospitality is not about us. It's not about our preferences. It's about how can we welcome the other in, show them love, and help them feel comfortable and at home in a place that probably doesn't feel very comfortable. I'm telling you, If you didn't grow up at this church, the first time you walked through those doors, you were probably nervous. It's tough to walk through the doors for the first time. But somebody here probably made you feel comfortable. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to look really quickly. We're getting over time, and I apologize for that. We're going to look really quickly at the screen and see some of these that you guys have put in. When I've been specifically invited by someone and they leave me in a sea of strangers and go to be with someone else. Oh my gosh, raise your hand if you have experienced that. That is terrible, right? Oh my gosh, I hate that. In a new class at school, none of my close friends are in it, and everyone seems like they already have close friends. Yeah, thank you for sharing that, because I know I've experienced that. Going to gatherings with my wife at our previous church, I always felt like an outsider, like I had to hide the person I was to accommodate an image that was normal in the eyes of so many. As a single person, I felt unwelcome in a church full of large families, not Grace. Thank you for saying that. Walking into the ladies' only lunch after being the only guy on staff. We all have those moments, and when we gather in a place like this where hopefully you do feel at home and feel welcome, it's important to remember those moments, because every time someone walks through that door for the first time, this is the possibility that they experience. When someone walks into our lives for the first time, those are the possibilities that they experience. And we have this distinctly beautiful way, this distinctly beautiful call from Jesus to be able to welcome them to the table and welcome them in uniquely Christian ways. The reason why I'm able to host Thanksgiving and Christmas Eve is because someone hosted it for me. Someone invited me to the table. Someone showed me what it's like to throw a good party. Someone showed me what it's like to stretch myself when I'm making my food, to spend a little more to get the better cut of meat, to work a few days ahead. Someone showed me how important it is to put in the work, to go beyond myself, to make others feel welcome. And that allowed me, the guest, to become the host. Christ has invited us to this table, has shown us the love, the grace, the hospitality, and the goodness, not so we can hoard it to ourselves, but so we can invite others to this table and host them well.